"He's going to leave you tonight, Rosie," Jessica whispered, her voice laced with venom as she leaned in close. "You're just the stepping stone he doesn't need anymore." A smug smirk stretched across her perfectly contoured face before she threw her head back, releasing a sharp, condescending giggle that turned heads and echoed over the clinking crystal in the Plaza Hotel's grand ballroom. She stood there, reveling in her imaginary victory, draped heavily in the Cartier diamonds Rosie's husband had funded. What Jessica didn't realize, however, was that her triumph had exactly 14 seconds left. Before the minute was up, a team of armed security guards would physically drag her from the building, and her precious billionaire boyfriend was next. To the rest of the world, Richard and Rosie were the epitome of the modern American dream. They were the quintessential power couple of New York's brutal tech scene. He was the charismatic, silver-tongued visionary from a modest Boston suburb, with piercing blue eyes and a jawline that belonged on the cover of Forbes. Rosie was the brilliant, quiet architect behind the scenes, a black woman from a wealthy Atlanta real estate family who had skipped 2 grades, graduated from MIT at 20, and wrote the baseline code that made their company, Saxon Innovations, a billion-dollar juggernaut. They met when they were 22. Richard was relentless in his pursuit of her. He made her feel like the center of his universe, breaking through the protective walls she had built around herself as a young black woman navigating the predominantly white, male-dominated tech world. When they married, Rosie made a decision fueled by pure, naive love. She let him take the spotlight. She transferred the patents for their flagship predictive AI software into a joint holding company, but she let Richard carry the title of CEO. Rosie took the title of Chief Technology Officer, perfectly content to stay in the lab while he charmed the venture capitalists and gave the TED Talks. For 10 years, it worked perfectly. They built an empire. They lived in a sprawling, $30 million penthouse overlooking Central Park. They vacationed in St. Bart's. But success has a funny way of revealing a person's true character. As Saxon Innovations approached its highly anticipated IPO, the Richard she knew began to fade, replaced by a man intoxicated by his own press clippings. The signs of his infidelity didn't arrive like a thunderclap. They seeped in like a slow, toxic leak. It started with the passwords. Richard and Rosie had always shared everything. Then, his iPhone 14 Pro Max suddenly had a new passcode. When she casually asked him about it while they were having coffee in their kitchen one Sunday morning, he didn't just answer. He launched into a defensive tirade about corporate security protocols and SEC compliance. It was an overreaction so severe it made her stomach drop. Then came the late nights. Richard claimed that the pre-IPO roadshows were keeping him at the office until 2 a.m. But when Rosie sent a surprise late-night delivery of his favorite sushi to the executive suites on the 45th floor of the Freedom Tower, the delivery driver called her, confused, saying the floor was completely dark and locked down. When she confronted Richard, he gaslit her with the ease of a seasoned sociopath. "Rosie, are you tracking me now?" he had scoffed, loosening his silk Tom Ford tie and looking at her with a mixture of pity and annoyance. "I was at the Harvard Club with Arthur Pendleton from the board. You're stressed about the IPO. You're becoming paranoid." She almost believed him. She wanted to believe him. But the final nail in the coffin of her ignorance came on a rainy Tuesday in early November. Rosie was sending Richard's custom Italian suits to the dry cleaners when she felt a thick piece of cardstock in the inner breast pocket of his charcoal Armani blazer. She pulled it out. It was a sleek, black receipt from the Van Cleef and Arpels boutique on Fifth Avenue. The purchase date was 3 days prior. The item, a vintage Alhambra diamond necklace. The price tag was $85,000, charged to his private American Express Centurion card. Her heart hammered against her ribs. 3 days prior was her birthday. Richard had given her a beautiful but surprisingly generic pair of pearl earrings, claiming he wanted to keep things understated this year. Rosie stared at the receipt, the cold reality washing over her, freezing the blood in her veins. He had spent $85,000 on a diamond necklace for someone else. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. Rosie was an engineer. Her brain was wired to identify problems, isolate the failing variables, and execute a permanent solution. She walked to her home office, locked the heavy mahogany door, and opened her encrypted laptop. The loving, supportive wife died in that room. The architect of his impending destruction was born. Rosie didn't say a word to Richard. That evening, when he came home smelling faintly of expensive champagne and a perfume that was distinctly not hers, a sickly sweet floral scent that screamed desperation, she kissed his cheek, asked him about his day, and served him dinner. The next morning, the moment his Aston Martin left their underground garage, she made a phone call to a man named Thomas Granger. Thomas wasn't just a private investigator. He was an ex-Mossad intelligence officer who specialized in corporate espionage and high-net-worth matrimonial disputes. He was the ghost that billionaires hired when they needed the absolute, undeniable truth. "I need eyes on my husband, Thomas," Rosie said, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the Manhattan skyline. 24/7. Digital, physical, financial. Leave no stone unturned. It took Thomas exactly 4 days to unravel the secret life Richard thought he had so cleverly hidden. They met at an unremarkable, dimly lit diner in Queens, far away from the Michelin-starred circles her husband frequented. Thomas slid a thick, heavy manila folder across the sticky formica table. "I've seen a lot of reckless men in my time, Mrs. Saxon," Thomas said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "But your husband is operating on a level of arrogance that borders on delusion." Rosie opened the folder. The first photograph was a crystal-clear, long-lens shot of Richard, leaving a luxury high-rise in Tribeca. Clinging to his arm was a young, striking white woman with long, blown-out blonde hair. She was wearing the $85,000 Van Cleef diamond necklace. Her name was Jessica Croft. She was 26 years old. 6 months ago, Richard had bypassed HR protocols to create a new position for her at Saxon Innovations, Vice President of Strategic Public Relations. Her starting salary was $350,000 a year, despite her resume consisting of a brief stint as a social media manager for a mid-tier fitness brand. But Thomas hadn't stopped at photographs. He tapped his thick finger on the second section of the file. "The infidelity is standard. It's the financials that are going to put him in a federal penitentiary." Rosie scanned the documents, her trained eyes easily translating the complex spreadsheets. Richard wasn't just cheating on her. He was bleeding their company dry to fund his fantasy life. He had used a shell corporation, cynically named J-Corp Management, to siphon over $4 million from Saxon Innovations' R&D budget. He used those funds to purchase the Tribeca penthouse Jessica lived in, outright in cash, listing the shell company as the owner. He was expensing her private jet trips to Aspen, her designer wardrobe, and her luxury SUV as corporate marketing expenses. He was embezzling from the very company whose core technology Rosie had invented. "He's finalizing plans to divorce you," Thomas added quietly, handing her a printout of an encrypted email chain between Richard and a sleazy, high-profile divorce attorney. He's timing it for the week after the IPO. He believes that because the patents are in the joint holding company, he can force a buyout, take half your wealth, push you out of the CTO role, and walk away with the company and the girl. She read Richard's words on the page. Rosie is too passive to fight this, he had written to his lawyer. She's a code monkey, not a shark. I can blindside her with the papers and she'll settle quietly to avoid a public scandal. A cold, dark amusement bubbled up in her chest. Richard had spent 10 years standing on her shoulders to look tall, and he had actually convinced himself he was a giant. He had forgotten one crucial detail, a legal safety net her father had insisted upon when Richard and Rosie first formed the holding company for her patents. Rosie immediately left the diner and went straight to the sleek, glass-walled offices of Bennett and Associates. Eleanor Bennett was a 70-year-old corporate litigator who ate arrogant tech bros for breakfast. She had been Rosie's late father's attorney and her fiercest protector. She dropped the Granger file on her desk. He's stealing from the company, Eleanor, and he thinks he's going to steal the company from me. Eleanor put on her reading glasses, flipped through the file, and let out a sharp, predatory whistle. Embezzlement, breach of fiduciary duty, corporate fraud. It's a bloodbath, Rosie. What do you want to do? I don't just want to divorce him, Rosie said, her voice steady, stripped of any emotion. I want to humiliate him. I want to strip him of his title, his wealth, and his reputation. I want him to leave the company with nothing but the clothes on his back. Eleanor smiled, a terrifying expression that crinkled the corners of her eyes. Let's review the structure of Harper Holdings. Richard thought they were equal partners. He thought he had the upper hand because he was the CEO. But he had never bothered to fully read the labyrinthine legal bylaws Eleanor had drafted a decade ago. While Richard and Rosie split the economic benefits of the holding company 50-50, the voting shares were a different story. Embedded in a blind trust, triggered only in the event of gross financial misconduct, were proxy shares that granted Rosie 51% absolute voting control over the board of directors. If she could prove the embezzlement to the board, she didn't just have the power to fire Richard. She had the power to seize his equity, lock him out of the building, and freeze his assets. The 10th anniversary gala is in 2 weeks, Rosie told Eleanor, an idea forming perfectly in her mind. The entire board of directors will be there, all our major investors, the media. I want the injunctions drafted. I want the forensic accounting verified. We strike on the night of the gala. For the next 14 days, Rosie played the role of her life. She smiled at Richard across the dinner table. She let him kiss her cheek. She listened to his lies about late-night meetings. Meanwhile, she was quietly meeting with the 5 major board members one by one. She showed them the Granger file. She showed them the stolen funds. The board members, mostly ruthless venture capitalists who cared only about the IPO valuation, were horrified. Richard's actions were a massive liability. In secret, behind Richard's back, a unanimous emergency vote was cast. Richard's termination was officially signed and sealed 3 days before the gala, but Rosie legally mandated that the execution of the termination would happen at her exact signal during the event. The trap was set. The jaws were open. All Richard and his mistress had to do was step inside. The night of the Saxon Innovations' 10th anniversary gala arrived with a bitter November chill, but inside the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel, the atmosphere was suffocatingly opulent. Chandeliers the size of small cars cast a golden glow over 500 of New York's elite. Waiters in white tuxedos glided through the crowd carrying silver trays of caviar and Dom Perignon. Rosie sat in the back of their chauffeur-driven Maybach, staring out the tinted windows as they pulled up to the red carpet. She wore a custom, emerald-green silk gown that clung to her curves, her hair styled in an elegant, intricate updo. She looked like royalty. She felt like an executioner, Richard slid his arm around her waist as the flashbulbs of the paparazzi exploded around them. He was wearing a bespoke Tom Ford tuxedo, flashing his signature $1,000,000 smile. "You look breathtaking tonight, Rosie," he murmured in her ear, squeezing her waist in a show of performative affection for the cameras. "Thank you, Richard," she replied, her voice smooth as glass. "Tonight is going to be a night we remember for the rest of our lives." He chuckled, completely missing the double meaning. "Damn right it is. This is my crowning achievement." His achievement. She just smiled and kept walking. As they entered the ballroom, the room parted for them. Richard immediately broke away to shake hands with investors and stroke the egos of the tech press. Rosie drifted toward the perimeter, a glass of sparkling water in her hand, observing the room like a hawk. Her chief of security, David Briggs, a towering ex-Marine who had been fiercely loyal to her since she personally paid for his daughter's experimental leukemia treatments 5 years ago, caught her eye from across the room. He gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod. He had the termination documents. He had the private security team on standby. The plaza's management had been briefed. Everything was locked and loaded. And then she saw her. Jessica Croft walked into the ballroom like she owned the building. She was wearing a breathtaking, sheer black sequined gown with a plunging neckline, a dress Rosie recognized instantly because she had seen the $22,000 charge for it on the company's stolen R&D corporate card. She had the $85,000 Van Cleef necklace glittering around her throat. She looked radiant. She looked invincible. She looked entirely out of her depth. Richard saw her too. For a brief, terrifying second, panic flashed in his blue eyes. He hadn't expected her to come to the gala. He had specifically told her to stay away to avoid arousing suspicion. But Jessica was young, arrogant, and clearly tired of being the secret. She wanted to mark her territory. Rosie watched as she locked eyes with Richard from across the room and gave him a slow, knowing smile. Richard quickly turned his back, furiously typing on his phone, looking like a cornered animal. Rosie decided it was time to mingle. She glided through the crowd, greeting board members who gave her subtle nods of solidarity. They knew what was about to happen. They were just waiting for the show. Eventually, she found herself standing near the massive, towering champagne fountain in the corner of the ballroom. She was alone for exactly 30 seconds before she heard the rhythmic clicking of stiletto heels approaching from behind. Mrs. Saxon. Rosie turned slowly. Jessica was standing there, holding a flute of champagne. Up close, her youth was glaringly obvious. She was beautiful, yes, but there was a desperate, hungry look in her eyes. She was a girl playing a woman's game. "You must be Jessica," Rosie said, her tone perfectly polite, betraying absolutely nothing. "Richard's new VP of Public Relations. We haven't been formally introduced." She took a sip of her champagne, her eyes raking up and down Rosie's emerald gown with thinly veiled contempt. "No, we haven't. Richard likes to keep his personal life and his real life very separate." The audacity of her statement hung in the air. She wasn't just marking territory, she was trying to provoke her. She wanted the angry black wife stereotype. She wanted Rosie to snap, to make a scene, to prove to Richard that she was the unstable, bitter woman he had painted her to be. "I imagine PR is a demanding job," Rosie said, her voice eerily calm, holding her ground. "Especially when you're managing accounts in Tribeca." Jessica's eyes widened a fraction of an inch. The mention of Tribeca, the location of her secret penthouse, clearly rattled her for a microsecond. But her arrogance quickly overrode her common sense. She assumed it was just a lucky guess, or that she was untouchable because Richard was the CEO. She stepped closer, invading Rosie's personal space. The cloying scent of that floral perfume filled her nostrils. "Let's cut the act, Rosie," Jessica sneered, dropping the polite facade entirely. She looked around to make sure no one was within earshot, though several board members were watching them like hawks from afar. "I know everything. I know your marriage is a sham. I know Richard is suffocating with you. You're just the boring, quiet engineer who got lucky." Rosie simply tilted her head, letting her dig the grave deeper. "Is that what he tells you?" "He tells me everything," she bragged, taking another sip of champagne. "He told me about the divorce papers. He told me how he's going to buy you out and push you out of the company. You're yesterday's news. You built the foundation, but I'm the one who gets to live in the castle." She looked at Rosie, expecting tears, expecting rage. Instead, Rosie gave her a slow, genuinely amused smile. That smile infuriated her. The sound of her laughter echoed over the clinking of crystal champagne flutes, a sharp, condescending giggle that turned heads in the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel. Jessica stood there, dripping in Cartier and Van Cleef diamonds Rosie's husband had bought her, a smug smirk plastered across her perfectly contoured face. She leaned in, her voice dripping with venom, and whispered, "He's going to leave you tonight, Rosie. You're just the stepping stone he doesn't need anymore." She threw her head back and laughed again, savoring her imaginary victory. She had no idea that in exactly 14 seconds, a team of armed security guards would physically drag her out of the building. "Jessica," Rosie said, her voice dropping an octave, carrying the lethal weight of absolute authority. "You're wearing $22,000 of embezzled corporate funds on your body. You're living in a penthouse that was seized by federal investigators 3 hours ago, and the man you think is a billionaire?" Rosie paused, raising her hand and snapping her fingers. A single, sharp sound that cut through the music. "He doesn't even have a job anymore." David Briggs and 4 enormous, unsmiling security guards materialized from the shadows, stepping directly behind Jessica. "Mom," David said, his voice like grinding stone, "you need to come with us. Now." For a fraction of a second, Jessica's perfectly sculpted face remained frozen in that smug, condescending smile. Her brain, likely clouded by the expensive vintage champagne and her own monumental entitlement, simply could not process the words that had just left Rosie's mouth. She blinked, her gaze shifting from Rosie's deadpan expression to the 4 massive walls of muscle in dark suits now surrounding her. "Excuse me," Jessica stammered, the mocking lilt in her voice entirely gone, replaced by a sudden, reedy thinness. She took a step back, her Louboutin heel wobbling slightly on the polished marble floor. "Who do you think you are talking to? I'm a vice president at Saxon Innovations. Get away from me." David Briggs didn't blink. He didn't flinch. He simply stepped forward, invading her space with the intimidating grace of a man who had neutralized much bigger threats than a panicked 26-year-old in a stolen dress. "Ma'am, you are currently trespassing at a private corporate event," David said, his voice carrying the calm, mechanical authority of a seasoned professional. "You have been officially terminated from your position at Saxon Innovations, effective immediately. You are going to walk out the service elevator with my team, or I will have you physically carried out in front of the press corps. The choice is yours." Panic, raw and unfiltered, finally shattered Jessica's facade. Her eyes darted wildly around the ballroom. The polite hum of Billionaire networking had begun to quiet down in their immediate vicinity. The clinking of glasses ceased. Heads were turning. New York high society thrives on gossip, and the scent of blood was suddenly very rich in the air. "Richard!" Jessica practically shrieked, all pretense of subtlety abandoning her. She stood on her tiptoes, frantically searching the sea of tuxedos. "Richard, help! Get over here!" Her shrill voice acted like a siren. Across the room, Richard, who had been deep in conversation with a managing partner at Goldman Sachs, snapped his head toward the champagne fountain. Rosie watched the color completely drain from his face. His tan, handsome features turned the color of old parchment. He muttered an apology to the banker and began aggressively shoving his way through the crowd. "Rosie, what the hell is going on here?" Richard demanded as he broke through the circle of onlookers, adjusting his Tom Ford blazer to project an air of command he no longer possessed. He looked at the security team, his blue eyes flashing with indignant rage. "David, what are you doing? Stand down immediately. Who gave you the authorization to harass my VP of Public Relations?" David turned to look at Richard. The utter lack of respect in the ex-Marine's eyes was palpable. "I take my orders from the head of the company, Mr. Saxon." "I am the head of the company," Richard roared, his voice booming across the suddenly silent ballroom. The string quartet in the corner faltered, hitting a discordant note before stopping entirely. 500 pairs of eyes were now locked onto them. Rosie took a slow, deliberate sip of her sparkling water. "Actually, Richard, you're not." Richard whipped his head toward her, his brow furrowed in a mixture of confusion and fury. "What are you talking about, Rosie? Have you lost your mind? Tell your pet gorilla to back off, Jessica, before I fire him, and then you and I are going to have a very serious conversation about your mental health." He was still trying to play the game. He was still trying to gaslight her, to paint her as the hysterical, paranoid wife in front of their investors. Rosie reached into the sleek emerald clutch she was carrying and pulled out a heavy, cream-colored envelope bearing the crest of Bennett and Associates. She held it out to him. "You aren't firing anyone tonight, Richard," Rosie said, her voice echoing clearly in the silent room. "Because as of 4 p.m. this afternoon, you were unanimously removed from your position as Chief Executive Officer of Saxon Innovations by the Board of Directors. For cause." Richard stared at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake. He didn't take it. He let out a harsh, incredulous laugh that sounded more like a bark. "You're delusional. You don't have the authority to call a board vote. We own the voting shares 50-50. You can't do anything without my signature." "Oh, sweetheart," Rosie said, tilting her head, allowing a genuine smile to finally touch her lips. "You really should have read the bylaws of Harper Holdings before you signed them 10 years ago. Section 4, Paragraph B. In the event of documented gross financial misconduct or embezzlement of company funds, the blind trust dissolves, and executive proxy control of the holding company defaults entirely to the primary patent holder." She tapped her chest lightly. "That's me, Richard. I own 51% of the voting shares. I called the emergency vote, and Arthur was kind enough to second the motion." From the edge of the crowd, Arthur Pendleton, the oldest and most ruthless venture capitalist on their board, stepped forward. He adjusted his silk pocket square and looked at Richard with absolute disgust. "It's true, Richard," Arthur said, his voice carrying the gravitas of a judge delivering a death sentence. "We reviewed the forensic accounting provided by Rosie's legal team this morning, the J-Corp Shell Company, the $4 million siphoned from R&D. We saw it all. You're done, son. You're a liability to the IPO. The termination is binding." Richard looked like he had been physically struck. He stumbled back a half step, his eyes darting frantically between Rosie, Arthur, and the envelope in her hand. His perfectly constructed reality was disintegrating in real time. "J-Corp," Jessica whispered, the color fully draining from her own face. She finally understood. She finally realized that the endless stream of money, the private jets, The diamond necklaces? It wasn't Richard's wealth. It was stolen money. And she was wearing the evidence. "Yes, Jessica," Rosie said, turning her attention back to the trembling mistress. "J Corp, the LLC that purchased your Tribeca penthouse. I hope you packed a bag before you came tonight, because at 6 p.m., my lawyers filed a federal injunction freezing all assets connected to that shell corporation. The locks on the penthouse have been changed by federal marshals. You don't have a home to go back to." You can't do that," Jessica shrieked, tears of sheer panic finally spilling over her mascara, leaving ugly black streaks down her cheeks. "Richard, do something. Tell her she can't do this." But Richard was paralyzed. He was a man watching a tidal wave crash over his life, entirely incapable of moving. "David," Rosie said gently, breaking the silence. "Miss Croft is causing a scene at my party. Please escort her out." "No, get off me!" Jessica screamed as two of the security guards each took a firm grip on her upper arms. She thrashed wildly, her stilettos slipping on the marble. The $22,000 sequined gown ripped at the seam as she struggled, the sound of tearing fabric shockingly loud. "Richard, you promised me. You said you were going to ruin her." But Richard didn't even look at her. He was staring at Rosie, his eyes wide with a terror she had never seen in him before. The security guards hoisted Jessica practically off her feet. She kicked, she screamed profanities that made the nearby socialites gasp and clutch their pearls, and she sobbed uncontrollably as they half-dragged, half-carried her out of the ballroom toward the service corridors. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind them, cutting off her hysterical cries. The silence that followed was absolute. 500 people held their breath, their eyes fixed on the disgraced king and the queen who had just orchestrated his public execution. "Rosie," Richard breathed, the words stumbling out of his mouth as if he had forgotten how to speak. The arrogant CEO, the silver-tongued charmer who had manipulated her for a decade, was gone. In his place stood a broken, terrified imposter. He took a step toward her, reaching out a shaking hand. "Rosie, please. Let's go somewhere private. We can fix this. You're angry, I understand, but we can talk about this. Don't throw away 10 years of marriage over a stupid mistake." Rosie looked down at his outstretched hand, feeling absolutely nothing. No pity, no anger. Just the cold, clinical satisfaction of a successfully executed algorithm. "A mistake is forgetting our anniversary, Richard," she replied, her voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. "Setting up a fraudulent shell corporation, stealing $4 million from my life's work to buy a luxury apartment for a 26-year-old, and plotting to steal my company out from under me isn't a mistake. It's a calculated criminal enterprise." "I can explain the money," he stammered, sweat now beading on his forehead, ruining his flawless grooming. He looked desperately at the board members who were watching him like a bug pinned to a board. "Arthur, you know me. I was going to put it back after the IPO. It was a bridge loan. I just needed liquidity." Arthur snorted, a sound of pure aristocratic derision. "Save it for the SEC investigators, Richard. They'll be auditing your personal accounts first thing Monday morning." Richard's knees actually buckled slightly at the mention of the SEC. He turned back to Rosie, his eyes wide and pleading. He tried a different tactic. He tried to play on the love he thought she still harbored for him. "Rosie, baby, listen to me," he whispered, stepping closer, trying to lower his voice so the vultures surrounding them couldn't hear. "I love you. I do. Jessica meant nothing. She was just a stupid distraction. You know how stressed I've been about the IPO. I cracked under the pressure. But you and me, we built this together. You need me. You're the genius, but I'm the face. The market will panic if I leave. The IPO will tank. The market invests in Saxon Innovations because of the predictive AI software that I wrote, Richard. Rosie corrected him smoothly, stepping back to maintain her distance from him. You were just the salesman. And frankly, your approval ratings in the tech sector have been slipping for months. The board actually believes the IPO valuation will increase once we announce we've purged a corrupt executive. You're not indispensable. You're a liability. Rosie signaled to David Briggs, who had returned from disposing of Jessica, and was standing a few feet away, watching Richard like a hawk. David, Mr. Saxon is no longer an employee of this company, Rosie said. Please collect his corporate property. David stepped forward. Phone and wallet, sir. You can't take my wallet, Richard yelled, a hysterical edge creeping into his voice. The American Express Centurion card inside that wallet belongs to Saxon Innovations, Rosie reminded him. As does the iPhone 14 Pro Max in your pocket. Hand them over, Richard, or David will take them from you, and I promise you, he won't be gentle about it. Richard looked at David's massive, unforgiving frame. Trembling with a mixture of rage and humiliation, he reached into his tuxedo jacket. He pulled out the sleek, black company phone and slapped it into David's open palm. Then, he pulled out his wallet, his fingers shaking so badly he dropped 3 of his own personal credit cards onto the floor before finally extracting the heavy metal corporate Amex. He handed it over. There, Richard spat, his face twisted in an ugly sneer. Are you happy now, Rosie? You've humiliated me. You've made your point. I'll have my lawyers contact Eleanor Bennett in the morning. I'm going back to the penthouse to pack my things. She almost laughed. It was incredible how his mind still desperately clung to the illusion of his own wealth. I wouldn't do that if I were you, Rosie advised him, her tone conversational. He stopped, narrowing his eyes. What are you talking about? Our Central Park penthouse, Rosie explained, enunciating every word so that it echoed in the silent ballroom. You didn't read the deed when we bought it, did you? You were too busy popping champagne. The penthouse is owned by Harper Holdings, which means, as of 4 p.m. today, it is solely under my legal control. Richard stared at her, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. I had the locks changed at noon, she continued relentlessly. Your personal belongings, the Armani suits, the Rolex collection, your golf clubs, have been packed into garbage bags by a moving crew. They are currently sitting in a storage unit in New Jersey. Thomas Granger will email you the locker number and the padlock combination, assuming you can find a computer to check your personal email, since I just took your phone. The absolute totality of his destruction finally landed. The realization washed over him in a visible wave. He had nothing. He didn't have his job. He didn't have his company. He didn't have his mistress. He didn't have his home. He didn't even have a credit card to book a hotel room for the night. The multimillionaire tech titan was suddenly, irrevocably homeless and broke. You bitch, he hissed, the charming veneer entirely stripped away, revealing the cruel, small man underneath. You set me up. You planned this. I didn't set you up, Richard, Rosie replied softly, stepping just inches from his face. I just stopped covering for you. You built your own gallows. I simply pulled the lever. Rosie turned away from him, addressing David. Mr. Saxon is leaving now. Please ensure he finds the exit. With pleasure, Mum, David said. He placed a heavy, uncompromising hand on Richard's shoulder. Let's go, sir. The party is over. Richard didn't fight back. The fight had been completely drained out of him. He looked around the ballroom one last time. He saw the venture capitalists he had golfed with, the tech journalists he had schmoozed, the board members he had thought he controlled. None of them met his eye. They looked away, sipping their drinks, completely distancing themselves from a sinking ship. He was a ghost to them already. With his shoulders slumped and his head bowed, Richard allowed David to guide him through the crowd. He didn't look back at Rosie. He walked out of the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel, leaving behind the empire he thought he ruled, stepping out into the freezing New York night with nothing but the tuxedo on his back. Rosie stood there for a moment, listening to the heavy oak doors close behind him. The silence in the room lingered for a few seconds more. Then Arthur Pendleton raised his glass of champagne high into the air. "To the new CEO of Saxon Innovations," Arthur boomed, his voice carrying a genuine note of respect. "To Rosie Saxon." "To Rosie!" the crowd echoed, a chorus of 500 voices. Rosie picked up a fresh flute of champagne from a passing waiter's tray. She raised it to the crowd, feeling the heavy, suffocating weight of the last 10 years lift entirely from her shoulders. The architect had stepped out of the shadows. The code had compiled perfectly. The system was finally bug-free. She took a sip of the champagne. It tasted like absolute victory. The weekend that followed the Saxon Innovations Gala was a masterclass in swift, merciless corporate maneuvering. While Rosie spent Saturday and Sunday locked in high-level strategy meetings with her executive team and their lead underwriters at Goldman Sachs, ensuring the impending IPO remained entirely on track, Richard was discovering exactly how steep the cliff he had fallen off truly was. He had checked into a depressing 3-star motel out near LaGuardia Airport, forced to use the last remnants of cash he had in his tuxedo pocket. According to the updates Thomas Granger provided Rosie, Richard spent 48 hours frantically calling every venture capitalist, angel investor, and tech CEO in his contacts list. He begged for bridge loans. He pleaded for consulting positions. He tried to spin a narrative that she had suffered a mental break and illegally locked him out of his own company. Out of 142 phone calls, exactly 0 people offered him a lifeline. In the ruthless ecosystem of New York finance, power is the only currency that matters, and Richard's accounts were completely overdrawn. He was radioactive. The true hammer, however, didn't fall until Monday morning. Rosie was sitting in her corner office on the top floor of the Freedom Tower, sipping a black espresso and reviewing the finalized S1 prospectus when her assistant buzzed in. "Ms. Saxon," she said, her voice carrying a note of nervous excitement. "There is a team of federal agents here to see you. They say it's regarding the financial discrepancies we reported." "Send them in," she replied, closing her laptop. The man who led the team into her office did not look like a typical accountant or a pencil-pushing investigator. Special Agent Harrison Wright was the head of the FBI's white-collar crime division in Manhattan, but he moved with the predatory, calculated grace of a man accustomed to physical warfare. Standing 6'3", with broad shoulders and sharp, assessing grey eyes, Wright was a decorated former Navy SEAL who had traded in his trident for a badge after a career-ending shrapnel injury in Fallujah. He possessed a legendary, almost terrifying reputation for dismantling billion-dollar fraud rings. He despised men in expensive suits who thought the laws didn't apply to them. "Ms. Saxon," Agent Wright said, extending a calloused hand. His grip was firm, his expression entirely professional, but there was a flicker of genuine respect in his eyes. "I've spent the last 72 hours reviewing the forensic audit your lawyers submitted. The J-Corp shell company is one of the most brazen, sloppily executed embezzlement schemes I've seen in a decade." "My ex-husband was never much for the finer details, Agent Wright," Rosie said, gesturing for him to take a seat. "He preferred the big picture and other people's money." A grim, razor-thin smile touched Wright's lips. "Well, His big picture now involves 20 to 30 years in a federal penitentiary, wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, tax evasion, and conspiracy to commit all of the above. Wright opened a thick black binder, laying out the federal warrants. We froze his remaining personal accounts at 6 a.m. We seized his Aston Martin from the company garage an hour ago. And right now, a team of my agents is currently kicking in the door of room 214 at the Starlight Motel in Queens. Rosie leaned back in her leather chair, letting that image settle over her. Richard, who had spent the last 5 years terrorizing waitstaff over the exact temperature of his Wagyu steak, was currently being handcuffed on cheap, synthetic carpeting. "What about Jessica Croft?" she asked, keeping her voice entirely neutral. Agent Wright flipped a page in his binder. The VP of Public Relations. We picked her up at a friend's apartment in Brooklyn early this morning. She's currently sitting in an interrogation room downtown. Took her exactly 4 minutes to ask for a plea deal. She's singing like a canary, Ms. Saxon. She's handing over every text message, every email, every encrypted WhatsApp conversation they ever had regarding the stolen funds in exchange for immunity. "Hard karma," she murmured, staring out the window at the sprawling city below. "There really is no loyalty among thieves." "No, ma'am, there isn't," Wright agreed, snapping the binder shut. He looked at her, his gaze analytical. "I've dealt with a lot of betrayed spouses in this line of work. Most of them are looking for a shoulder to cry on, or a way to get revenge that ends up hurting them just as much. You built a legal mousetrap and just waited for him to take the cheese. It's highly efficient." "I am an engineer, Agent Wright," Rosie replied calmly. "I don't believe in crying over a broken machine. I believe in replacing the defective parts." Wright nodded slowly, his respect solidifying. "I'll need you to come down to Foley Square tomorrow to sign formal statements. But off the record. Enjoy the IPO, Ms. Saxon. You earned it." Later that afternoon, the news broke. It hit the financial terminals first, then exploded across the mainstream media. Saxon Innovations ousts CEO amid multi-million-dollar embezzlement scandal. FBI makes arrests. The photographs accompanying the articles were devastating. There was Richard, looking disheveled, unshaven, and utterly terrified, being shoved into the back of an unmarked black SUV by federal agents. The tech world went into a brief, frenzied tailspin. Pundits on financial news networks debated whether Saxon Innovations could survive the scandal. But Rosie had anticipated the panic. She had prepared the algorithm for this exact scenario. At 4 p.m., she released a meticulously crafted press statement. She didn't hide behind PR jargon. She laid out the facts. She explained that the company's internal safeguards she had personally designed, had caught the discrepancy. She reassured the market that the core proprietary AI technology was secure, fully patented, and entirely under her control as the new CEO. She projected strength, transparency, and absolute unflinching competence. The market didn't just stabilize, it rallied. By the time the closing bell rang, institutional investors were praising the company's ruthless corporate governance and visionary new leadership. Richard's removal wasn't a tragedy. It was a highly lucrative cleansing. 6 months later, the air in New York was thick with the humid promise of early summer. The floor of the New York Stock Exchange was a chaotic sea of screaming traders, ringing phones, and flashing screens. Rosie stood on the iconic balcony overlooking the trading floor, wearing a sharp, custom-tailored white suit. David Briggs stood to her right, an immovable mountain of security, while Eleanor Bennett, her fierce attorney, stood to her left, smiling proudly. At exactly 9:30 a.m., She pressed the button to ring the opening bell. The sound echoed through the massive hall, followed by a deafening roar of applause. Saxon Innovations officially went public. Their initial offering price was set at $45 a share. Within 2 hours of trading, fueled by the massive hype surrounding their new predictive AI models and the pristine, scandal-free image the company now projected, the stock surged to $92 a share. By noon, her net worth officially crossed the $5 billion mark. She wasn't just a wealthy woman. She was one of the most powerful, self-made billionaires on the eastern seaboard. While she was celebrating at a private luncheon at Le Bernardin, Richard was sitting in a windowless courtroom in downtown Manhattan, wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. The trial had been short, brutal, and entirely one-sided. Agent Wright and his team had built an impenetrable case. Jessica had testified against Richard, painting him as a manipulative mastermind who had forced her into the lavish lifestyle, a laughable defense, but effective enough to keep her out of prison. Richard's defense attorneys had tried to argue that the funds were a misunderstood corporate loan, but the paper trail of fake invoices and forged signatures was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with zero tolerance for white-collar entitlement, delivered the sentence without a shred of sympathy. "Mr. Saxon," the judge had said, looking down from the bench at her trembling ex-husband, "you were given every advantage in life. You were handed the keys to a kingdom built on the brilliant work of your wife. Instead of gratitude, you chose greed. You chose arrogance. You stole from your investors. You betrayed your partner. And you attempted to use the legal system to finalize your theft." The judge struck her gavel. "I sentence you to 108 months in federal prison without the possibility of early parole, followed by full financial restitution." 9 years. Richard had collapsed into his chair, burying his face in his hands, weeping audibly in the quiet courtroom. He was stripped of his dignity, his freedom, and his future. He would be transferred to a medium-security facility in upstate New York, far away from the Michelin-starred restaurants and bespoke tailors he thought defined his worth. As for Jessica, she didn't escape the fallout unscathed. While she avoided jail time, the IRS completely dismantled her life. They seized the jewelry, the designer clothes, and the remaining cash in her accounts to pay the back taxes on the gifts Richard had given her. With her reputation utterly destroyed in the PR industry, the last Thomas Granger reported, she was working as an assistant manager at a mid-tier retail clothing store in suburban New Jersey, struggling to make rent on a tiny one-bedroom apartment. Justice wasn't just served, it was absolute. It was a flawless execution of cause and effect. That evening, after the IPO celebrations finally wound down, Rosie returned to the Central Park penthouse. The massive space was quiet, entirely hers. The lingering ghost of Richard's presence had been thoroughly scrubbed away by a team of interior decorators who had replaced his ostentatious modern art with elegant, meaningful pieces that reflected her own taste. She poured herself a glass of a rare, vintage Bordeaux, walked out onto the sprawling terrace, and looked out over the glittering expanse of the city skyline. For 10 years, she had made herself smaller, so a deeply insecure man could feel large. She had dimmed her own brilliance to let him shine. She had built the engine, but let him take credit for the speed. Never again would she make that mistake. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a text message from Agent Harrison Wright. Over the past 6 months of trial preparation, their purely professional relationship had evolved into a quiet, mutual respect. They had shared coffees, discussed the psychology of fraud, and found a strange common ground in their shared demand for accountability and order. "Congratulations on the IPO, Ms. Saxon," the message read. "The market likes a winner. If you ever want to celebrate over a steak that isn't corporate-sponsored, let me know." Rosie smiled, the cool night breeze playing with the edges of her white jacket. A real, genuine smile. She typed back a brief, promising reply, slipped the phone back into her pocket, and took a sip of the rich red wine. The city below her was a labyrinth of power, ambition, and ruthless competition. But looking down from the top of the world, she wasn't intimidated anymore. She was exactly where she belonged. She was the architect of her own empire, and the foundation was finally unbreakable. And that is exactly how you execute the ultimate takedown. Rosie completely flipped the script, securing her billion-dollar bag, while Richard traded his Tom Ford suits for an orange jumpsuit. It's the ultimate story of hard karma, proving that you should never underestimate the quiet genius behind the scenes. We absolutely loved watching Rosie rise from a betrayed wife to a ruthless, unstoppable CEO, and the addition of Special Agent Wright bringing the federal heat was just the icing on the cake. If this incredible story of justice and revenge had you cheering at your screen, you know what to do. Smash that like button, share this video with anyone who loves a flawless comeback, and hit subscribe to join our community for more intense, real-life drama stories. What was your favorite moment of Rosie's revenge? Drop a comment below and let us know.